Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Just depends on what time of day you are watching this. Shake my hand. My name is Leroy Maisiri, and I am, the lecturer in place for this week. And we've just been looking at the 1980s People's Power moment. We've been looking at what was the 1980s People's Power moment. How do we read such a liberation moment? How do we, translate it? And then later on, as I conclude this lecture series, when I talk about what we can learn from it in 2023, like learning from the past to help the future, so to speak, right? So just a quick recap of our first lecture, which I hope everyone is kind of like caught up with, right? In lecture one, we learned that you guys are readers, right? That's a key takeaway point, right? You guys are readers. You are reading towards your degree. So please, once again, look at those readings that I've put in the folder. Look at the other readings, the broader literature that I spoke to you guys about that really maps this out, and then understand, how those readings are set out, And then we learned that there's always been a dialectical historical transition in South Africa when we're looking at all those areas that Ms. Marquette has brilliantly walked you guys through. And then we also learned about what a patriotic history is, but also managed to problematize the literature between structural approach and conspiratory approach, and really why this week we want to kind of like go, above and beyond a patriotic history, right? So then we said, we also covered, or we went through what the People's Power was aiming to create, right? A new bottom-up forms of governance outside the state and many times against the state, right? And then we spoke about, very much a crucial difference between liberation versus democracy. And then we kind of like laid the foundation. And by laying the foundation here, I'm referring to setting the scene, so to speak, how the 1980s came about. Looking at the previous decade, we saw that a foundation was laid. The 1970s set the scene with the workers' struggle of 1973, followed by the students' revolt of 1976, right? And at the center of the struggle process lays an almost forgotten past, right? And that's why I'm here today, right? There's this. It always feels like there's this layer that's missing historically when we talk about anti-apartheid movements, right? And this forgotten past of the role played by other anti-apartheid currents outside the ANC, of course, and the South African Communist Bloc, right? So what I'm doing here is one of two things. I'm not minimizing the role of the ANC and the South African Communist Party and the role of Umkhonto weSizwe and all those very important things that happened. What I'm trying to do is actually to shine a light on a much forgotten past, a much forgotten tradition, which is the People's Power movement, which to me, till today, represents a more radical vision and a more radical kind of politics than the negotiated compromise of 1994, right? So I'm pretty sure someone's going to take you guys next week around that time period of the 90s, and you'll see the difference. I really hope you'll be able to see the difference. And I would like to put all my cards on the table right now and say that I believe that the 1980s tells us a story of the South African working class that began to mobilize by themselves, form and strategize in a very coherent working class program and using an independent, working class organizations. And if you remember, I kept kind of like, bringing up the term counter power yesterday, and that's exactly, what I was referring to, right? So, as far as recaps go, I'm very happy with that. So maybe we can just start, with today's lecture. Right, so I'm going to quickly give you guys a 1980s overview, right? I mean, by now we kind of like have a very good sense of exactly what was going on. But today I want to actually pull out some specific examples. My examples, unfortunately, are not exhaustive. There's just not enough time, guys. As I was preparing lecture 2, I realized, geez, there's not even enough time to get into detail about the UDF, the United Democratic Front. There's not even enough time to talk about all these other organizations and formations. There's actually not even enough time to speak about other independent left groups that were trying to work or influence People's Power movements, like the New National Unity Movement or the Marxist Workers' Tendency that split for ideological reasons from the ANC in the 1980s, right? There's just not enough time. So once again, reading and your readings become your best friends, because those journals and those books I've recommended really do take you through a beautiful journey, right? So I'm just going to be really, really try and be succinct. Ms. Makwetu doesn't want these videos way too long, and I understand why, right? So I will once again keep focusing only on people's power moments and organs of power, because that's just the limited time we have to do with those type of things, right? So the 1980s just saw a massive, massive increased number of national school boycotts across the townships. Several hundred people detained and killed by the police. And just to give you guys an example, and note, there are many of these incidences, but on the 24th of July, 1980, right, 10,000 Joburg municipal strike workers went on strike, and a total of 16,707 people were convicted alone that year, simply for political supported charges, right? In September 1984, there was the 8,000 strike in gold miners, who were met obviously with violence, right? Police force. Out of that number, 7 died, 89 injured, right? In that very same month, we saw a massive uprising spread from townships like, the Sebokeng in the Vaal Triangle, right across the country, right? The Vaal uprising that began in September 1984 on to 1985 exhibited the tenacity of the People's Power movements and the type of impact these community protests could do. And someone like Jeremy Seekins covers a lot of that kind of stuff if you go through the readings that you were given right now. Workers and students, if I can just help you catch up with me here, right? Workers and students and communities were all involved in all these strikes and protests, right? On the 26th of September 1984, schools reopened, but can you imagine, only about over 93,000 students refused to go to class. This was such a big issue. In 26 October 1984, violence occurred in the Sebokeng area again, as 7,000 police and troops swamped the area and made hundreds of arrests in an attempt to stamp out unrest, with crowds of up to 2,000 people stoning the police. So this decade, 1980 to 1990, saw several, as a response to the unrest and a response to people's power. This decade saw several declarations of state of emergencies, declared in several parts of the country. In July 1985, the state of emergency actually even lasted for 6 months. 6 months, you can imagine curfews, stop blocks everywhere with police and so forth. And during the state of emergency, about 575 people were killed in actual political violent incidences, right? So in 1986, on the 12th of June, there was another state of emergency that was declared, and this time, this one lasted across the country. The whole country had to be declared under a state of emergency. And by 1987, on the 7th of June, another state of emergency was declared, and this pattern persisted. It just kept continuing. And it was one of the few ways the state believed it could try and curtail the impact or the continued influence and growth of the People's Power movement, right? In response to some of the organs of power, right? So 1980 was really a decade of intense ideological debate and mobilization, right? The ideological debate here, you remember in lecture 1, we spoke about how ideas matter. And it really, when you really want to understand, what was going on in the township-based struggles, etc., you really want to zoom into the ideas that were influencing and shaping these things. When you do that, it's almost as if you're very much quickly able to neatly package these ideas. You can see nationalist ideas, where they came from and what they wanted to achieve. And then you can compare them with what was on the ground. What did the people want? What did those ideas look like? And how did they go about trying to achieve them? That concept of pre-configuration that I introduced in lecture 1, right? So there was a boom, a lot of boom in this intense ideological moment. There was a boom in anti-capitalist labor movement, right? So apartheid was seen as racial oppression, absolutely, within a racial capitalist system, right, that suppressed a class, the working class, right? There was a boom in that thinking, right? So to fight thy enemy, we need to understand their enemy, and how you analyze your enemy most of the time influences your strategy, influences your tactics on the ground, right? So all of a sudden we can see that dialectical historical moments I was talking about, where specific type of oppression garners or gets a specific type of response, right? So these erratic strikes and protests in places like, Art Village, Paddock, Tata, to be honest with you, across the country, were sure signs to express, and they were very clear about this. You go through the issues with pamphlets, Msebenzi pamphlets, the UDF political pamphlets. If you go through most of the literature, Moses Maikiso's literature, the Fosatu documents, they were very clear that they wanted to express the end of capitalism, the end of tyranny, the end of racial oppression, right? Because, all these things were very much interconnected to their everyday struggle, okay? Right. So I mean, I hope that's kind of like clear in really shaping how they analyzed what was going on and what they wanted. Right. So, let's kind of like look at then, within apartheid, right, within this context of apartheid to people's power, right? So the first issue here is these guys were really the conditions that caused the formation of these organizations were bread and butter issues. If you talk to, good Marxists, they'll be like the material conditions, right? So by addressing these bread and butter issues, automatically people got, conscientized. You are driven into politics, so to speak. Talking about why don't you have money? Why don't you have work? Why don't you have employment? Why don't you have housing? Why is there sewage? Why is the municipality not caring about fixing the sewage going down your doorstep? Why is the water brown? Why don't you have electricity? All these issues combined automatically started to drive people towards politics, right? And so through these issues, people get politicized and conscientized. Mikey, so another great set of work to read from the union perspective, argued that effective township organizations allowed for extremely effective protest actions with high degrees of popular support around these bread and butter issues, right? So the formation of strong self-organized bodies made it possible, right, to run massive campaigns. Okay, so essentially people started to meet to discuss these bread and butter issues, and they would do it openly and in defiance with the law. Once again, guys, you have to remember this is during the intensification era of violence, the intensification era of segregation, the intensification era of apartheid itself, right? It's really, you're not even allowed to be, I think, walking threes or twos and to talk about political stuff. It was against the law. So this was happening in complete defiance of that. Now, not only the structure, right, not only how they structured themselves as people's power, but in these communities, but the actual meetings, the actual places of discussions became organs of power, right? So I'm talking about the structures themselves, the general meetings. Firstly is where the grassroots democracy really began, right? And that's the beginnings. That's when we can say, okay, so this is what grassroots looks like when you talk about grassroots democracy, and why people like to say it belongs to people's power. That's the main basic organ of people's power, right? How they'll sit and talk about these issues, not only talk about the issues, but delegate what to do next according to what they agreed in these general meetings, right? So this became a very, 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 very important, seeding beginnings of grassroots democracy, right? This is where they'll decide the boycotts, the strikes, the tactics, etc. Okay, so self-organization, in many ways reached a peak, with widely representative community elements, right, who took control of important aspects of township life. And the leaving of government officials, and just so we're clear, government officials in the townships didn't just leave, they were removed. The people decided themselves that these people who are appointed on behalf of the state, right, like local municipalities, for example, these local municipalities are not doing anything for us. they are not for us, they don't work for the people. All those people were removed, forced to resign, whether it was a black councillor, right? But a black councillor a lot of the time would be viewed as a puppet of the National Party. So they were forced to resign, right, in the townships. And this created a big vacuum, right? Now, these vacuums or these empty offices, these empty departments, these empty positions within the townships, became civic structures that needed to be filled, right? So this was a period in which street civics and street committees started to run public services. So they started to do it themselves. There was a water committee, a road committee. They even created their own police, their own watchdogs, type of thing. In fact, there are so many townships that became no-go areas for the actual police. They're people's courts. But we'll talk about all these things, right? So when youth organizations came about, they created their own people's parks. When people created their own self-defense groups, right? There were anti-crime patrols, like I just said, and this understanding of struggle as self-empowering became central to anti-apartheid propaganda. And this was articulated in concepts like people's power or amandla ngawethu. Right? This is what it meant by amandla ngawethu, like the people shall govern. They really, really, really started to take full control of their lives, so to speak, despite apartheid. Right? Now, only in 1986, when the organs of people's power had already emerged in many South African townships, the exiled ANC, made its famous call for ungovernability and a people's war, so to speak, right? And you see by 1985-ish, sectors across South Africa began not to only assert a vague aim, right? But, ideologically, it might start off as an idea. But from 1985, you can actually see it's no longer just a vague aim of people's government after apartheid, but there was a struggle towards it in radical ways, right? So that pre-configuration that I keep telling you guys about, right? The apartheid local government in many townships was in a state of collapse. Calls for people's power to replace the systems were in evidence, were happening. Even the exiled ANC, like I said, argued that the time had come for a move for making apartheid ungovernable to build in people's power. And to be clear, the ANC and the South African Communist Party in exile saw this mainly as a means of preparing the ground for an MK-led uprising, a people's war that they would run. So I just want to repeat that point. To be very clear, yes, there was a call from the ANC to kind of like, render apartheid government ungovernable, and that came much later on, like roughly around about 1986. And just to be clear, what that call was, the intention of that call was actually to use the people's power moment and the organs of power as a way to prepare the ground for armed struggle, right? To prepare the ground for an MK-led uprising, a people's war that would then run, the liberation struggle, right? While many ordinary people, including ANC supporters in the UDF, actually took the call quite literally, took the call for themselves that me, yes, me, a normal person, I must go render the apartheid government, ungovernable. Okay, so, I think we should quickly look at some of the aims, like what did they want to achieve? Now, the People's Power movement was struggling for a radically different system than what existed there, right? And that's quite clear. A complete overhaul of the current system. So they didn't even want a single part of it. So apartheid was synonymous to capitalism. Capitalism required the exploitation of workers. Apartheid maintained racial, oppression of the same type of people. And so they wanted a complete change of everything. And there was no signs. If you look at all the literature in the 1980s, if you look at everything that they wanted, there were no signs of a negotiated compromise. Right? There were no signs of, well, if we don't get ABC, maybe we can end up with something that is a bit of both, a bit of what we want and a bit of the current. There was no signs of such a compromise. The demand was clear. They needed to be a full, complete power shift, right? Politically, economically, socially, from the ruling class to the working class. Building a people's power with this in mind meant struggling for everything, guys. Meant struggling for people's education, which was run below, people's courts run below, with ordinary people, elected as magistrates, right? And people's power in communities through civics groups and street by street organizing. Everything had to be organically built from a grassroots level. Remember, what we ended up discovering was the beginnings of grassroots democracy, right? So if you look at stuff like Isizwe, like which was this incredible UDF journal that ran a lot in the 1980s, right? There was a piece in it called Building People's Power. And in it, they argued that the people's power and the working class took the Freedom Charter, which was a radical program. And I'll remind you, the Freedom Charter is actually from the SACTU era in terms of how your course has been broken down. So this is from 1955. They took that Freedom Charter quite literally when it said the people shall govern. Now, this call was taken up by millions of South Africans, by 1985. A lot of youth, a lot of women, it's unfortunate that I might not get a chance to cover, the important role of women in the 1980s revolution. A lot of, unions like for SACTU, but also working with the community. It took millions and millions of people to take that call, quite literally, right? So, I think this is quite a lot to aim for. And if you ask a lot of people today, I'm pretty sure they're going to agree that this is still worth aiming for because it has not yet been fully achieved, right? So the people's power is something that was built in the course of struggle, right? This power had to be worth it, is what I mean here. It had to be able to do things, right? Your organs of power couldn't exist just for the sake of meeting. They had to be able to counter that current lived reality that a lot of people were dealing with, right? The people's power had to change the people's life. It had to be concrete, fix the schooling, right? There were protests around education, they had to fix it. They had to fix the crime in the townships. They had to fix their bread and butter issues. This is even more apparent if you think about it in contrasting terms. So if you think about the nationalist approach or the ANC/South African Communist Party approach, for example, the MK position, right, the Mkhonto position in reality meant ordinary people would have been liberated by an army that infiltrated the country. That's really what that ANC call meant, and really would have happened. And we've seen it, like Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe 1980s liberation struggle is a story of armed struggle. It's a story of Mugabe and his army versus people's power, and that's a big contrast, right? So when you say people's power, we have to remember that it actually had to have a very, 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 very real concrete. It had to be able to do it. It had to be able to counter the National Party, counter their police, counter their systems, counter the insidious jail cycles, people going into prison in and out, counter the treason executions. They had to save themselves, essentially. Furthermore, in contrast, when you look at the Black consciousness movement of in the 1970s, which did a lot of amazing things. I'm sure by now you've also watched the recording of the brilliant guest lecturer about Steve Biko in the 1970s and everything that they achieved back then. Because Black consciousness stressed on conscientizing people, breaking the mental chains of apartheid, rebuilding dignity amongst the community. But it struggled, humbly I say, to find ways to act beyond this. And the proof is in the pudding, right? It lacked a real program for mass-based change. And this was clearly shown in how it was crushed in 1976. So the Black conscious movement was marginal to the unions, and its unions had no clear program to translate the use of that type of power for revolution or, say, occupational factors, etc. So it was a very, very important moment. But I'm just trying to contrast what an armed struggle would look like, what the BC moment would look like, and actually what the People's Power moment looked like and what it did. Like, just so we can really get a sharp understanding of the differences there. And so by mid-1980s, the apartheid government, losing control literally in many parts of the country, people by themselves begin to exert real control. Right, township struggles all over the country ensured that the apartheid municipal council system in the townships completely failed. Within a short notice of space of all time, all over townships where strategic power vacuums once lay, they were all taken over and controlled by residents, with yard committees, and which in a yard, which then built to street committees, which then built to block committees, and then block committees would join specific other committees, and it just continued like that, right? Given the massive resistance, many townships had become no-go areas for the police and the army, right? Literally. And just to talk about it in terms of a numbers game, if you're talking about a call to render the apartheid government ungovernable, and millions of South Africa across South African townships all simultaneously respond to the call at the same time, the state has automatically lost. Why? You only have a limited number of police and army. I promise you, yes, they've got guns, and yes, there's this ideological concept that the state has this monopoly, and it does, it really does. The state has a monopoly on violence. Nobody has more means of violence than the state through the arms of the police and the army. But even if the state was to deploy police and soldiers today at the same time, it would be almost absolutely impossible for them to completely cover the entire country. And because of that, right, a spontaneous, simultaneous, although uneven in many ways, right, a response of a real people's power movement meant that there was no ways the police could curtail a fire. You'd be trying to stop something here, and then it's happening in the next township, and it's happening in the next township. And eventually, you start to have serious no-go areas, right, which is a very important part of their strategy, if you think about it. Right now, there were different approaches to people's power, or rather, there were different aspects to it. So I don't want us to paint over this with just one big brush. So I just want to quickly, identify just a few examples, right? So the development of replacing administrative structures with people's power organs took place across the country, right, with the development of street committees, right? So that's number one. Street committees were a very, 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 very big thing. Reportedly, just to give you an example, one of the first street committees in the 1980s was the Craddock Township of Lingelihle, and this was made up of about 17,000 residents, divided into 7 zones, assigned to about 40 activists who were responsible for holding meetings in each zone. And by the way, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, it's just that right now I wouldn't be able to put up a reference for you, but I'm pretty sure we're talking about weekly meetings. And not just in this one township, I'm talking about across the country. There were weekly meetings. For example, in this Craddock Township, where 17,000 people met up in their 7 different zones. Weekly meetings. We didn't get water this week. What are we doing about it? So and so did this week. What are we doing about it? Weekly meetings in slowly but surely transforming, their communities. Organs of people's power developed to positively affect all aspects of life. So this meant the creation of People's Clinic, right? Literally run by the people, health forums, soup kitchens, right? People's courts were all raised an alternative to the oppressive system. And in some areas, the unemployed youth who were a massive big part of the struggle did other things. They did cleanup. They cleaned up the neighborhoods. They started people's parks. They started recreational areas. So this meant creating new organs, people's organs, right, with their own values, right? It meant an alternative collective, creating the space for it, collectively rewriting, like I said in lecture 1, with that capitalism crisis in the 1970s coming, to the shores of South Africa with the 1980s recession, you'd think Margaret Thatcher was right all along. You would think when she said there is no alternative, she was right. And yet in South Africa, we had people's powers of organs actually proving wrong and creating the alternative themselves, through these organs of power. The struggle, really my argument would be that it taught large parts of the working class and the organs of powers what they needed to be by all accounts in a democratic manner. It showed them what they needed in their committees and how they can go about doing it in a very democratic manner. At their best, for example, and I know there are a lot of weaknesses, and I know there are a lot of criticisms, and we'll get into them. But at their best, the People's Courts, for example, were not in the business of distributing chastisement, right? I'm talking about the ideas there, the ideals, why they were set up, but rather they were there built to maintain and create a value system that was set by the community standard, and its main task, which is to remain a guardian of the people, whose main task really was political and educational, right? It had its limitations, of course. I'm not trying to, rewrite history and just be to fully romanticize the 1980s, but I'm just saying these organs of powers really had a big thing to aim for, right? They really were seeking out the highest form of freedom. Remember, we spoke about the difference between liberation and democracy, and that human psyche that is always anti-authoritarianism, anti-oppression, seeking out the highest freedom. The organs of people's power, their value system, in my argument, was around that, right? So let's kind of like dig in for more examples. There was also one of my favorites, by the way, the Federation of the Transvaal Women, the FDTRAW. And just from about 1986, they decided to come together and create working class preschool for children whose parents could not afford to send their kids to school, or were not available during the day because they were trying to work or find work and were not able to pay, right? So now this Federation of Transvaal Women created like a schooling system, but it was a progressive preschool. It taught children who were too young to enter primary school and provided those little kids with political education. In fact, they've got a few mini books, poetry books, and if you read them, you'll see what I mean. The women of the FDTRAW put together a book of stories and poems called Our Mama, and in there were poems like "Apartheid is a rotten tomato, freedom is a sweet potato." Right? Imagine 3 to 4 to 5 year olds. If you read Gramsci's work, if you read a lot of stuff around historical materialism, you must remember that at some point in time, you have to start changing the superstructure of the society you're in. You have to start giving a society new ideas. New ideas shape new patterns. So if you're teaching 3 to 4 to 5 year olds, a new generation to come, that apartheid is a rotten tomato, but freedom is a sweet potato, interesting things can begin to happen. So in the 1980s, highlighted the alternative measures towards emancipation, and could in no way be built inactively. You had to get on the ground and start creating your own organs of power. All experiences, I would argue, in fact, show that it is only through militant struggle that they were able to make spaces like these to build people's power, right? What an incredible example. Right. Now, it is clear, right, from the above that people's power movement went well beyond protest, right? So, when you bump into literature that just tries to summarize it as just unrest, as just violent acts, go beyond that, right? Go beyond that. They did so much more. That protests are very important. I'm not denying that. I'm simply saying they also went about creating new forms of organizations outside the existing state, and that many of the practices also involved degrees of creating organs of power like parks and creches, contesting state control of resources like the racist school system, and concurrently implemented not just liberty, right, but also equality and fraternity. If you read Nauna's book, or Nuna, however you pronounce it, what's the book called? They're burning the churches. A brilliant book, right? He reports that even funerals, at people's funerals, those became frequent sites of political activity, because through the cover of those funerals in the 1980s, it was one of the many few places people could gather, with a reduced chance of being interrupted and threatened, right? It was not always the case. I mean, even during, several Sharpeville massacre memorials, like, the annual anniversary of the Sharpeville, some people were killed during those anniversary days as they were mourning and remembering the past. But it was one of the few places with a reduced chance, just to kind of like show you the heightened, era of violence and tension, where people could meet, slightly uninterrupted. And so they used funerals as sites of meetings and places to talk, forward. But actually, speaking about this book, here it is there. They are burning the churches, this book gives an account, an aside to apartheid struggle, where churches themselves played a big role in the struggle against apartheid, side by side with people's organs, and situates the Vaal Triangle as a site where the liberation struggle led by people organs began in earnest. And I think it's an incredible book if you get to read it, and you really start to understand how many different types of institutions had to exist, for this militant struggle to continue. There was the Vaal Ministries Solidarity Group, VMSG, largely made of clergy people, right? This group was formed to fill in the void created. Remember, the number one rule for apartheid, and the reason why conspiracy literature dominated was because the state viewed the ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe and South African Communist Party, as this one big menacing thing, controlling everything, right? So just because the state viewed them as the ones controlling everything does not mean the state's analysis was correct, okay? And so what would happen is one of the big state tactics was executions, arrest of civic and political leaders. So you'd always see these big main figures, friction in jail all the time. And so, the VMSG group started to fill the void created by the arrest of these political leaders. VMSG enabled banned people's organs to meet under the umbrella of clergy meetings. In many ways, the church had to participate in a lot of white lies, so to speak. VMSG at the church positioned itself at the center of the people organ meetings, specifically to be able to understand the complex and constantly changing situations in the streets. So your yard committees, street committees, block committees also had to start feeding these church committees so that there was this oneness in the community. All right, these meetings allowed the group to be able to understand and interpret events as they unfolded, and perhaps when necessary, to assist with constructive focus and direction, right? Another example right here in the Eastern Cape, was and there's been another, about 3 or 4 years ago, there was another brilliant book that was released on this, on the late comrade Matthew Goniwe, right? In Cradock. Cradock is just outside Grahamstown / Makhanda, right? So they created the Cadora Executive Cabinet Kitchen, right? And the name means exactly that. They met a lot in kitchens, right? In the kitchen of Matthew Goniwe's home, etc. Now, upon his release, so Matthew Goniwe was actually in jail, right? Arrested by the apartheid government, for being an instigator, for being an ANC, active agent, etc., etc. But upon his release from prison on the 31st of August, 1981, he went back to the ground and continued what they called the M plan, the Mandela plan, right, which was set to set up networks of closely linked underground cells, which would keep the ANC alive despite all the bans in place by the regime. So once again, remember, the main body of the ANC is in exile. There are small cells running around, doing stuff, and he really went to go and reactivate that in Cradock, right? In 1981, the ANC had established, the area political committees, or APCs, and these committees were given oversight of political structures inside the country. Matthew led, the underground political activists in Cradock. Within this unit was a sub-unit also formed by Matthew that was in charge of strategic defense of local struggle, whilst the main cell was the political think tank, right? This type of people's organ had a code of conduct drawn up to it, right? It was imperative. If you follow Matthew's work, he really, really wanted people of integrity. When you compare and contrast, with what we have today, interesting times, right? So I just thought, just kind of like to stick up this brilliant, Eastern Cape example. On top of all of what I've mentioned, we had committees and civics. The civics were, in short, residents' associations, right, within the different townships that dealt with concerns of the people, right? So they would elect leaders. I think there was a chairperson, secretary, treasurer, etc. And I think you only had about 3 years of running, but you could be removed at any moment, right? So it's not like you could finish your term. You literally work for the people. If you're not doing your mandates given to the people, you're removed in the next meeting, right? But you had a 3-year term and you're allowed to renew the term if that's what the people wanted you to do. Now, the duty of the leaders was to report back to the communities in which they were based. A very important point is that the leaders were part of these communities facing the exact same problems as their other residents. The people residents would use these leaders to tell them what to do, how to go about, fixing stuff. There was a culture of accountability, that revealed itself in procedures during the meetings, in regular report bits, and continual communication. The idea of leadership there was serving the community, and it went in hand with a sensitive and careful attitude towards decision-making process, that grassroots approach. Remember, right at the beginning of this lecture, we said we can really see that, grassroots democracy actually really starts or is rooted in these general meetings. It's not like the leader has a dream and a vision for the people and then goes to execute it Moses style. Everything is fed from below. Civics interacted in different ways with more localized forms of self-organizations, like the block yard, street yard, committees. Like the civics, these were formed to tackle specific problems, right? Very, very, very specific problems, like high rentals, poor electrification or no electrification, bad housing, the bucket system, and the crime. These local communities centered on ordinary township residents, often without political experience or organizing or facilitating skills, right? And then I've hinted a lot around it, so I just want to quickly, illuminate it a little bit. These street committees. Street committees were simple, right? So they would have house meetings were held on all streets, right? So wherever that street that you live on, right, whatever the name of that street, there was house meetings held somewhere there. And the people from each street elected a representative of the street. And here are some of the duties that each street representative had, and each street representative then formed part of the street committee. The street representative must know all the problems of the people in that particular street. They must represent the needs of the street at the representative committee meetings. They must report all representative committee meetings back to the street. The representative committee is building unity in the area because it represents all streets, right? So it's such an intricate, built system. And by the way, this type of radical democracy is a whole lot much more work than voting once every 5 years. This type of democracy, I would like to kind of like suggest, is really, really, really radical in all the things that it tried to do, in all the things that it achieved to do, but it's also very radical in the type of commitment it requires out of the people themselves. I mean, this is literally dealing with these issues every single week of your life, not going to change a political party every 5 years or a municipality every 3 to 4 years, right? It's a very big contrast. If you really if we can just apply our minds to what we had and what we have, very big. The street representative must not work alone, right? But with the help of all the people in the street. So the street rep is the link between the rep committee. In this way, people are working together to build, one big, strong organization, right? And so I really think for the most part, this is where I would like to kind of like, end a lecture 2. And really, I feel like I've kind of like really tried to shine a light, on where we can start, in terms of searching for more information as we go into the readings, as long as we now understand all these big things. The final lecture in our series is really one that is now just going to simply focus on the limitations of the people's power, some of the negative things that came out of it, so to speak, things to look out for. But in doing so, not to throw the baby with the bath water, actually draw out lessons. What lessons can be learned, and dare I say, can even still be applied today, right? Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Cheers.